It is an 11-day journey from Mount Sinai to the border of the Promised Land. But they were not lost. But the Sinai Peninsula strips all of that away. There is no river, there are no canals. There is only a brutal, unyielding geography of granite and dust. You cannot engineer your way out of thirst in this desert, you can only look up. At Mara, God tells Moses to throw a piece of wood into the pool. The water becomes sweet. A few chapters later, at Rephidim, the test escalates. This time, there is no bitter water to heal. There is no water at all. The panic is absolute. The people are ready to stone Moses. They were following a visible, physical pillar of fire by night. They demand to know why he dragged them out into the wasteland just to murder their families and livestock with thirst. Notice what God does, or more accurately, notice what he does not do. He does not strike them down. He does not unleash fire. He does not punish them for their panic. He simply tells Moses to take his staff, the exact same staff that struck the waters of the Nile, and strike a rock at Horeb. When he does, water violently erupts, not a trickle. To keep a population of this scale alive under a desert sun, you do not need a small spring. You need millions of gallons. You need a localized river pouring out of a dry, cracked stone. This detail changes how you read the beginning of the wilderness journey. Before they reach Mount Sinai, before the covenant is made and the law is given, the Israelites complain constantly. They murmur, they accuse. And God answers every single complaint with pure provision, no judgment, no plagues, and a pillar of cloud by day. Why? Because right now God is treating them like traumatized victims, not accountable rebels. They are infants in freedom. They do not know better. When an infant screams in the middle of the night, a father does not punish it for lacking patience. He gives it water. God is establishing a new baseline of trust. He is proving that he is a better provider than Pharaoh. But water is only half of survival. The bread is about to run out. Exactly 1 month after leaving Egypt, the provisions in the carts run dry. The flour they packed in haste is gone. The herds are too vital for the future to slaughter in the desert. Hunger sets in, and once again, the trauma speaks. God knew exactly where they were. The Israelites accuse Moses of leading them into the wasteland simply to watch them starve. God responds by raining bread from heaven. Every morning after the dew lifts, a fine flake-like substance covers the desert floor. It looks like frost. It tastes like wafers made with honey. The Hebrew text records their immediate reaction. Manhu, literally meaning, what is it? We call it manna. But the miracle of manna is not just agricultural, it is deeply, intensely economic. God does not just drop food from the sky. He attaches a strict, terrifying rule to it. Gather only enough for today. The exact measurement is an omer per person, roughly 2 quarts, just enough to sustain 1 human body for 24 hours. And then comes the hardest command of all. Do not leave any of it until morning, which means the wilderness was not a navigational error. Think about how terrifying that instruction is for a former slave. Poverty, abuse, and captivity hardwire the human brain for scarcity. When you find a resource in a brutal environment, your survival instinct screams at you to hoard it. You hide it. You stockpile it because you never know when the master will take it away. The entire Egyptian empire was built on the economics of hoarding. The Israelites themselves had built the massive store cities of Pithom and Ramses, giant architectural silos designed to hold Pharaoh's endless surplus of grain. That was their only mental model for security, a massive stockpile. God is deliberately attacking that model. He is rewiring their economic instincts. When some of the Israelites inevitably try to hoard the manna, stashing a little extra in their tents overnight just in case, The text says the next morning it breeds worms and stinks. It literally rots in their hands. Furthermore, the text notes that when the sun grew hot, whatever was left on the ground melted. The window to gather was short. You had to wake up and participate in your own provision. It was a deliberate, generational furnace. The only exception was the day before the Sabbath, when they were commanded to gather a double portion. On that day alone, the extra manna miraculously stayed fresh, forcing a slave people to unlearn the endless, exhausting grind of Egyptian production and learn the sacred rhythm of rest. The manna is not just calories, it is a daily liturgy of trust. God is teaching them that you cannot stockpile Him. You cannot create a surplus of grace so that you no longer have to depend on Him tomorrow. Every single morning, an entire nation of former slaves had to walk out of their tents, look at the empty desert floor, and learn the hardest lesson of freedom. Security is not found in the size of your storehouse. Security is found in the character of the one providing the bread. This was the classroom. God was patient, but the classroom was about to end. A deprogramming. They are marching toward the border. And the ultimate test is not about what they will eat, but who they are willing to fight. They finally reach the border, a place called Kadesh Barnea. They are standing on the southern edge of Canaan. The endless, blinding white gravel of the Sinai is behind them. Ahead, the terrain suddenly changes. It rises into the rugged hill country of the Negeb. This is the moment, the finish line, the culmination of the Exodus. Moses sends 12 men, one leader from each tribe, to scout the territory. They are gone for 40 days. For nearly 6 weeks, these men walk the unseen length of the country. They move through valleys heavy with agriculture. We are going to walk through the major tests of the wilderness, the thirst, the hunger, the rebellion, and the breaking point at the border. They actually cut down a single cluster of grapes in the valley of Eshcol, so massive, so heavy, that it has to be carried on a wooden pole suspended between 2 men. The land is exactly what God promised. It is violently fertile. But there is a problem. The cities are heavily fortified, high stone walls, and the inhabitants are massive, the descendants of Anak. 10 of the 12 spies return and drop a contagion of panic into the camp. They deliver a single sentence that exposes the fatal fracture in the wilderness generation. Numbers 13:33. We seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. Slow down and look at that phrasing. This is not a military assessment. This is a psychological diagnosis. Notice the sequence of the words. First, we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers. Only then do they add, and so we seemed to them. The terror did not originate from the Canaanites. To see exactly how an 11-day route became a 40-year story, the terror originated inside their own shattered self-image. They have watched the 10 plagues dismantle the greatest empire on earth. They have walked on dry ground between walls of seawater. They have eaten bread that falls from the sky. But deep inside, they do not view themselves as the redeemed holy army of the living God. They still view themselves as slaves, prey, small, vulnerable insects waiting to be crushed by a superior force. Pharaoh is dead, but his voice is still speaking inside their heads. The camp absolutely fractures. An entire population weeps through the night, but the grief quickly turns toxic. The panic mutates into open treason. In Numbers chapter 14, they cross a threshold they have never crossed before. They say to one another, "Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Think about the sheer horror of that demand. And we are going to see how this narrative turns geography into a study of memory, trust, and whether a rescued people can actually learn to live free. They are not just complaining about a dry waterhole. They are organizing a coup. They want to elect an anti-Moses. They are actively plotting to march back across the searing desert, walk up to the taskmasters, and hand themselves back over to the empire. They are voting to completely undo the Exodus. And in this exact moment, the patience of heaven runs out. The glory of the Lord suddenly appears at the tent of meeting. The shouting stops in its tracks. Up until this moment, the wilderness was a place of divine patience. When they cried out in thirst, God gave them water. When they cried out in hunger, God gave them bread. He handled them as fragile victims of a brutal empire. That is not a historical estimate. When the waters of the Red Sea collapsed on Pharaoh's chariots, the physical rescue of Israel was finished. But Kadesh Barnea is not a trauma response. It is calculated covenantal treason. They have stood at the base of Mount Sinai. They have been sprinkled with blood. They have sworn a binding legal oath to the God who rescued them. They are no longer just abused slaves. They are a rescued bride, openly organizing a committee to return to her former abuser. The legal status has changed, and the response from heaven changes with it. God issues a sentence that permanently alters biblical history. Numbers 14 records the decree, because the spies spent 40 days walking the land in unbelief. The chains were gone. The nation will spend 40 years walking the wasteland in judgment, a year for every day. Everyone 20 years old and upward, every single adult who marched out of Egypt, who saw the sea part, who gathered the first manna, is permanently disqualified. They will never cross the border. Think about the sheer crushing weight of that math. We hear the phrase 40 years, and our brains flatten it into a simple historical delay, a long detour. But convert that number into human reality. To bury an entire adult population of that size over 4 decades means digging graves every single day. The Sinai Peninsula ceases to be just a harsh landscape. It becomes a massive generational cemetery. For roughly 14,600 days, the primary rhythm of the camp will be funerals. It is a suffocating reality. The taskmasters were dead. They have to physically turn their backs on the green, fertile hills of Canaan. They have to pack up their tents, turn around, and march back into the blinding, abrasive heat of the deep desert. And notice the devastating irony of the verdict. In their panic, the adults wept and screamed that their little ones would become prey for the Canaanite giants. God takes that exact accusation and turns it upside down. He declares that the children they said would be victims are the very ones who will inherit the land. The parents will feed the desert sand, but the toddlers will tear down the walls of Jericho. The disease of Egypt was simply too deep in the parents. You cannot defeat giants if you still think like an insect. Israel was legally and physically free. The slave mentality cannot be reformed. It has to be outlived. The 11-day journey has just become a lifetime. They turn south. The camp marches back into the wasteland, carrying a collective death sentence. But the poison of Egypt does not die quietly. In Numbers 16, the resentment boils over. This is not a chaotic, desperate riot over water. This is a highly organized, elite mutiny. A Levite named Korah rallies 250 recognized leaders of the congregation, men of renown. They confront Moses and Aaron, and their argument sounds almost democratic. All in the congregation are holy, every one of them. Why then do you exalt yourselves? Listen to the underlying mechanism. This is the slave mentality attempting to seize power. They do not want to submit to the covenant structure God designed. They want to be the new pharaohs. The response is terrifyingly swift. The earth physically splits open. The ground swallows Korah, his tents, and his inner circle alive. But freedom is not just a change of location. Fire drops from heaven and consumes the 250 leaders holding their censers. The old guard is violently dismantled. The physical structure of rebellion is wiped out in a single afternoon. Israel is finally learning a devastating truth. The greatest threat to their survival is no longer an Egyptian chariot bearing down on their flanks. The threat is internal. This internal purging reaches its peak in Numbers 21. They are nearing the end of the 40 years. Thousands of graves have been dug. The old generation is almost entirely gone. But as they detour around the harsh territory of Edom, the people break again. They accuse God. They loathe the manna, calling it worthless food. This time, the judgment is visceral. Venomous snakes flood the camp. The Hebrew calls them nehashim seraphim, fiery serpents. The bite burns. People drop to the desert floor. But when the people repent and beg for the snakes to be taken away, God does not simply make the reptiles disappear. He orders a deeply counterintuitive cure. He tells Moses to forge a serpent out of bronze and elevate it on a pole. Anyone who is bitten must physically look at the bronze snake to survive. It is a change of mind. Why a serpent? Because God is forcing them to look directly at the shape of their own rebellion. He does not offer a magical potion. He forces them to stare at the emblem of their judgment. The physical venom was literally inside their veins, just as the spiritual venom of unbelief had been circulating in the camp for 4 decades. The bronze serpent was the visual embodiment of their own internalized poison. To live, a dying Israelite had to admit they were infected. They had to look at their own death to receive their life. Pharaoh is a fading memory. The taskmasters are gone. The true enemy was their own stubborn refusal to trust. And now, finally, the poison has run its course. The graves are full. The 40 years are up. The landscape changes one final time. The blinding white gravel of the deep desert gives way to the plains of Moab. The Jordan River cuts through the valley ahead of them. And just across the water, the palm trees of Jericho are visible. Moses is 120 years old. And the brutal reality of the Exodus is this. He stands up to speak to the camp, but he is looking out at a completely different sea of faces than the one he led out of Goshen. The people who wept at Kadesh Barnea are buried in the sand. The men who organized the rebellion are gone. The generation that demanded to return to the brickyards has been entirely consumed by the wilderness. Except for Joshua and Caleb, the 2 spies who held their ground. Every single adult who marched out of Egypt is dead. The people listening to Moses now are in their 20s, 30s, and 50s. They were toddlers when the sea parted, or they were born years later under the shadow of the pillar of cloud. It takes one night to get Israel out of Egypt. They have never felt an Egyptian whip. They have never been forced to meet a brick quota. They have never bowed to a living pharaoh. They are the free-born generation. And this absolute demographic flip is the only way to understand the book of Deuteronomy. The word Deuteronomy comes from the Greek translation of the text, meaning the second law. But Moses is not inventing a new legal code. He is repeating, expanding, and recontextualizing the Sinai covenant for a people who do not have the trauma of the empire imprinted on their brains. The parents received the law, but they processed it through the psychology of slaves. They heard God's commands and instinctively flinched. But it is going to take 40 years to get Egypt out of Israel. They treated Yahweh like just another taskmaster, assuming that the moment they failed, he would crush them. The children need to hear the law differently. They need to receive it not as the heavy demands of a dictator, but as the living constitution of a free, holy republic. When you read Deuteronomy, the tone shifts dramatically from the mechanical lists of Leviticus. It is a long, urgent, pleading sermon. Moses is standing on the edge of his own death, knowing he cannot cross the river with them, and he is trying to transfer the theological weight of the last 4 decades into the minds of a generation that did not witness the plagues. He has to deliver the law a second time because a free-born people must choose the covenant voluntarily. They cannot coast on the fading fumes of their parents' rescue. But there is a dangerous vulnerability in this new generation. Think about what happens to a human being who has only ever known slavery. They do not have the slave mentality, but they also lack the visceral first-hand memory of the rescue. And Moses knows exactly what will happen the moment they cross the Jordan River, when they finally eat from vineyards they did not plant, and sleep in fortified houses they did not build. The comfort will do what the blistering heat of the wilderness never could. It will put them to sleep, which is why the final instruction of the desert is not about military strategy. It is about the discipline of memory. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, Moses hammers a single Hebrew verb over and over, zakar, remember. He tells them to remember the whole way the Lord led them these 40 years. It is an explicit geographical detail recorded in the very second verse of Deuteronomy. Every meal you have ever eaten was provided by a master. He tells them to remember the terror of the deep wilderness, the water bursting from the flint rock, the fiery serpents, and the manna they did not recognize. He is not being nostalgic, he is warning them, because memory is the only defense a free people have against returning to spiritual slavery. Moses knows exactly what is going to happen when they cross the river. The daily miracle of the manna is going to stop. The visible pillar of fire is going to vanish. For the first time in their lives, they are going to harvest their own grain. Every task you ever performed was driven by the threat of a whip. Drink from their own wells and lock the heavy wooden doors of their own houses. And in that comfort, a deadly illusion will take root, the illusion of self-sufficiency. Moses explicitly warns them that when their herds multiply and their silver increases, their hearts will lift up and they will say, "My power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth." Listen to the tragedy of that sentence. The moment an Israelite believes he is the architect of his own survival, he has resurrected Pharaoh inside his own heart. The physical empire of Egypt was dead. Your value was tied entirely to your daily quota of mud bricks. But the psychology of the empire is always waiting to be reborn the moment we forget our absolute dependence on God. If they forget the wilderness, they will simply build a new Egypt inside the promised land. They will exploit the poor. They will hoard their grain. They will worship the fertility gods of Canaan because they want to control the rain. This is the blinding reality for anyone reading this text today. We hate the desert. We hate the delay. When we cry out for rescue, we want God to instantly deliver us and drop us right on the border of the blessing. But God knows what we do not. You do not know how to trust. He knows that if he hands us the inheritance while we still have the mindset of a slave, while we still panic, hoard, and demand control, the blessing will utterly destroy us. The wilderness is not God abandoning you. The wilderness is God loving you enough to burn the empire out of your blood before he hands you the keys to the house. Moses finishes his sermon. He climbs the jagged heights of Mount Nebo alone. He looks out over the Jordan River and sees the fertile green expanse of the land he is not allowed to enter. It has been 40 years. 14,600 days of funerals, manna, bitter water, and blinding sand. You do not know how to govern yourself. But as he looks down at the young, free-born army preparing to cross the water, the math finally makes sense. It is an 11-day walk from the mountain of the law to the edge of the promise. It could have been done in less than 2 weeks. But it took 40 years because God was not just moving a people out of Egypt. He was getting Egypt out of the people. If this opens something up for you, the biggest thing you can do is subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who needs it. That is genuinely how people find this content. We depend on you to spread the word. Please keep us in your prayers. God bless you. You only know how to survive under the heavy hand of an empire. You cannot take 2 million traumatized, deeply conditioned people, drop them on the edge of a new land, and expect them to suddenly live as a wholly self-governing nation. If you do, they will simply build a new Egypt, 11 days on foot. They will hoard. They will exploit. They will bow to the gods of the nations around them, because that is the only world they have ever known. So God does not take them straight to the border. He takes them deep into the Sinai Peninsula, into a brutal, barren landscape of jagged red granite and endless gravel plains. A place where nothing grows on its own, a classroom made of rock and sand, where every drop of water. But if you turn back the pages of your Bible and read the book of Numbers, and every scrap of food requires an absolute, terrifying dependence on heaven. The wilderness is not a delay. It is where the slave mentality goes to die. Exodus 15 ends with a song. The women are dancing. Timbrels are shaking. The sea has just swallowed the greatest military superpower on the earth. For a few hours, the sheer adrenaline of deliverance masks the reality of where they actually are. But adrenaline fades. The sea is behind them. Ahead of them is the wilderness of Shur. No roads, no shade, just miles of sun-baked limestone and heat shimmering off the desert floor. 3 days into the march, the water runs out. You do not find an 11-day journey, and instantly the illusion of their newfound freedom shatters. They do not hold a council to pray. They do not look to the massive pillar of cloud leading them. They turn on Moses and they panic. This is the first major psychological tell in the wilderness narrative. It exposes something deep inside the human condition. Slavery is brutal, but it is predictable. When you are a slave in Goshen, you might be beaten, but you know exactly where the river is. You know where the leeks, the onions, and the garlic grow. The empire provides the baseline mechanics of survival in exchange for your humanity. Freedom, on the other hand, is terrifying, because freedom in the wilderness means looking at an empty, barren horizon and realizing no one is coming to save you unless God himself does. You find a 40-year burial march. When faced with the raw terror of uncertainty, the human instinct is almost always to choose a familiar cage over a frightening horizon. Over and over in these early chapters, the Israelites repeat a complaint that sounds insane to modern ears. Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. Listen to what they are saying. They are romanticizing the empire. The very empire that was drowning their infant boys in the Nile River just a few months earlier. Nostalgia is lying to them. Trauma has deeply distorted their memory. They are literally willing to put the heavy collars back on their own necks if it just guarantees them a predictable meal. This is why the physical removal from Egypt was only the beginning. God can part a sea in a single night. But healing the psychology of a battered, abused, and thoroughly institutionalized people requires a different kind of miracle. And this creates an immediate, glaring problem. It requires systematically breaking every assumption they have about how the world works. In Egypt, Pharaoh was the ultimate provider. Pharaoh controlled the water. Pharaoh controlled the grain silos. Pharaoh was considered a living god who commanded the environment. To break that deep generational imprint of the empire, God has to take Israel to a place where Pharaoh's economy cannot reach. He has to isolate them. He has to let them feel the burning vulnerability of the desert, so that when the water finally flows, they learn a completely new model of reality. They reach an oasis called Mara, but the water is undrinkable. It is bitter. Imagine the physical reality of this moment, a massive crowd. People often assume the Israelites wandered for 4 decades because they were lost in the desert. Men, women, children, and livestock. Throats swollen, lips cracked from the dry, abrasive desert wind. They rush to the edge of the pool, cup the water in their hands, and immediately spit it out. It is a psychologically crushing blow. In Egypt, water was a mathematical certainty. The Nile River was the most predictable hydrological system in the ancient world. It flooded like clockwork, depositing rich black silt. You could measure it. You could engineer it. Deuteronomy later describes Egypt as a place where you watered the ground with your foot, referring to the human-powered water wheels and small irrigation channels. In the empire, human labor managed survival.